So the normal way people talk about strategy is as a plan. They want you to set your objectives and then describe the way in which you're going to reach them. This involves a sequence of events that gets you from where you are now to the future. I've always found this view of strategy inadequate, because the whole thing about strategy is that it's about when sets of decision makers, independent decision makers, interact with each other. For governments, I think there's a particular issue in that not only must they now plan for how to get us out of the current problem, they've got to plan for a resumption as well. And this again is one reason why I think it's important to think of strategy in terms of stages rather than as a movement to a particular objective. So strategy requires sensitivity to what others are doing, an understanding of power, an understanding of your own priorities, and a readiness to be flexible, a readiness to improvise, a readiness to move to the next step. I think the first requirement for any organization or country or even family unit is survival. The first requirement is, what absolutely do you need to do to stay in business or to keep going? So in the UK, the government defined the key requirement as stopping the NHS being overwhelmed, which, given what had happened elsewhere, was by no means a bad objective. But it meant that other potential objectives were not given the same attention, which is why we find ourselves with such a problem. One of the reasons why we find ourselves such a problem with care homes. And for some businesses, it may well be wise to say, we can't do this anymore. It's just not going to work. It's going to take too long before people are out and about sufficiently to have what we want. Or we can survive, but only by doing something very different to what we've done already. And a lot of businesses are doing that already. First, the requirement is to be totally realistic about what's going to happen. You can't just rely on wait and see. So one of the lessons I think that has come out of this so far, which I suspect was going to last, is the issue of resilience. If you look at the problems the country is facing at the moment, one of them is that we've organised all our services, including the National Health Service, for efficiency, for just-in-time logistics, using every bit of capacity to the maximum extent, not having much redundancy in the system because that's expensive. Well, first thing is, we're not going to be able to afford not to have redundancy, not to have spare capacity, not to have stocks of things, because as we found, when everybody needs the same stocks, they're quite hard to find. So one of the consequences of that is not only that you start to build redundancy, which has a cost into the system, but you're going to think much more about supply lines. So, and again, this is not a particularly original thought, but globalization is not going to be what it was. Not only will there be less travel, because we've all learned how to do quite interesting meetings without having to get on an aeroplane. An aeroplane's bad for the environment anyway. So not only will there be less travel, there's going to be a preference for having key supplies close to home. So I think at an organizational level, those that have treated their employees well and sensitively will reap advantages later on, presuming that they've been able to afford to do that, but there will be advantages. I think the relationship between the state and the people is also a really interesting one that will change. That governments have now had to praise people who are generally on minimum wage, often on minimum wage, or are the sort of people who just keep everything going without having to have lots of professional education in order to be able to do it, but we still need them, and we miss them when they're not there. The role of the welfare state which has been challenged substantially over the last few decades, is bound to make a comeback. But if it's making a comeback, then it has to be paid for. So we're then going to get back to issues of taxation and distribution. And again, this can argue it's like a sort of socialist manifesto. I don't think it is, because it's still going to require markets, and it's not a sort of an argument for everything that has to be nationalized and run from the center. But it is going to make a profound difference, I think, to social attitudes and expectations. The government thinking ahead is going to have to recognize that some of the things that have been taken for granted, put in the can't do list because they're too difficult, but probably desirable, but still too difficult. All of those things are going to have to be looked at. I think the final point I would make, trying to think about these things with a degree of strategy, is that it's evident that some individuals and firms have been quite innovative, and that their innovations do show possibilities for the future. Obviously, some companies have done very well. Others have been, say, restaurants, have managed to find a new clientele. And I mean, how successful their takeaway services will be, who knows? But they've been quite innovative. And I think that this fits in with, you know, the first stage of thinking about survival, and the next stage is to think, well, not only how do we recover, but what is it that we can now do in an environment where people may be still a bit wary about leaving home, or at least gathering in large settings. How do you give people what they would still like to have gone out for, but maybe a bit nervous about getting, until some such point as there's vaccines here and we're all relaxing and trying to go back to normal? But I think there are so many things that have been learned about how it is possible to operate working from home, for example, organizing things over distances, and also the things that you just can't do that way. You learn about that as well. The ones that are going to do best out of this are those who are going to build on the more positive aspects of this experience, rather than those who are going to be yearning for return to the good old days when everything was easier. At the end of the day, we have to recognize this is, and I've lived a long time, this is a truly transformational event. The world is going to be very different as we come out of this, in ways that are still quite difficult to be sure about, because, you know, we have to keep in mind that we've had a few months of this. I don't think it'll be a few years, but it's hard to imagine it all being over for another 6 months or so. And if that's indeed longer, and if that's the case, the deep impacts, including particularly on the economic side, are going to be reverberating for a long time.